so that you may introduce our guest. Just to let you know, as the Zoom just told us, that we are recording this portion of the Presbytery meeting, this theological discussion, and Minister of Word and Sacrament Jason Tucker has given his consent for this recording. The discussion, as mentioned earlier, we will also be breaking out into breakout rooms, but there will not be, the breakout rooms will not be recorded, just so everybody knows that. So your conversations are not being recorded in the breakout rooms. Only the presentation and then what we discuss following the presentation will be recorded and packaged up for future, potentially for future use. So at this time, Carol, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, I told y'all I would be back, and I believe Jason's going to join me on the screen here, but here's what happened. My friend Greg Fairchild said to me one day, you want to go to this virtual conference with this guy named Jason Tucker? And so I said, well, sure, and this was during COVID times. And so we did. And I went with that same mixture of skepticism and hope that I approach many conferences that I go to. And then when I went to the conference, I found myself in my own living room going, brother, you preach it now, you preach it, you tell it. You tell it. And I really loved it, Jason. And I've been kind of like his little groupie ever since because I've followed things that he's done. Now he's got credentials. We're Presbyterians. I got to share the credentials. He is a minister of the Word and Sacrament. He got his MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary and a doctorate stressing church revitalization from Fuller Seminary. But he's also currently a pastor. He's been at the Tower Hill Presbyterian Church in Red Bank, New Jersey for about 9 years, I think. And he's also been a national presenter, and he's also been a youth leader, and he's also been a worship leader. And all of that is really good stuff, but that's not why I'm so excited that you're here today, Jason. I'm excited because I believe, first of all, as a consultant, when you're still there in the church, and you're living through the things that our pastors live through and our congregations live through, it gives a different tone to the things that you share. And then also because I believe Jason has a real heart for ministry and a passion for the Church of Jesus Christ and for the next generations. Now, he sometimes says things that maybe are hard to hear and that sometimes we don't like that much, but he always says those with humor and with humility. And I know that it comes out of a love and a desire for the church. So I could go on, but I'm not going to take any more of this good man's time. Jason Tucker, we're so glad that you're here and look forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Carol. That was like, I think I need to pay you for that one. I mean, that was just astounding. But thank you so much for having me again. I'm so glad to be here. It's been great getting to know some of the folks in your presbytery. I feel like I know the Presbytery of Arkansas. It's kind of cool. I've had a lot of conversations with many of you, and it's been really great. Of course, I'm excited to be here. I think, just so you know what my beating heart is. My beating heart is, I don't believe God is done with our historic denominational churches. However, he will be done if we decide not to partner with him. And I think there are some issues here and issues that we're going to talk about today. I want to go through some theological issues of the church, but I also want to go through some sociological issues of the church. I think a lot of the problems, it's easy to look at church and sort of identify what are the practices or systems that seem to be broken or not be effective. That's okay. That's something maybe you would do in a business context as well. However, I think there's a theology behind it that's really important to address so that you can get to the what is the best thing for our churches. And my belief is we don't need to just blow up all the churches and make them all warehouse contemporary churches. Instead, I think the Lord has given us resources. The Lord has given us a deep theology. I think we have the tools at our disposal that are needed for healthy churches. And when I talk about church growth, I don't just mean numbers. I mean, how do we create even small, healthy churches that are bearing good fruit, that are self-sustaining, that are not scratching to survive, but showing the world how well they can thrive, right? So that's what I care about the most in this world. And I was a small church pastor for 3 years. I was a solo pastor in a small, dying, declining church, and then am in leadership in what I call a mid-sized church, although by PCUSA standards, we'd probably be considered large, but we're really a mid-sized church for the last 9 years. And I trained with one of the busiest consultants in America, Dr. Bob Weitzel. So I've had this opportunity now to say, how do we take all of these things and help churches do this work of revitalization, even if they feel like they don't have any or very little resources? So the way that this time today is broken up is we're going to talk theology. There's going to be a breakout room discussion, and then we're talking about putting into practice that theology. And then there's going to be a time for Q&A. So as we're all ready to go, and everyone's just been to the restroom, so we're all good. You guys are good for a while. Okay. So let me share my screen and we will get started. I will need to do the obligatory, can everyone see my screen? Everyone just give me a thumbs up, right? You can see my screen, great. This talk and this discussion, I'm calling Signed, Sealed, and Delivered on Yours, a theology of church revitalization. Because I think if you don't address the theology of church revitalization, you're at the risk of it not taking off because you feel like maybe what you're doing goes against what God wants for the local church. In other words, do we feel like we're catering too much to culture? Do we feel like we are losing our distinctiveness of who we are as a church? Sometimes those questions get scary enough to stop us from moving forward. But if you have a good theological mindset behind it, none of those questions are ever scary. So let's talk about that. In Alan Roxborough's book, Missional, Joining God in the Community, he opens with this really great illustration of a friend of his who's a marine biologist who's swimming the Great Barrier Reef and is explaining that, you know, here I am swimming this Great Barrier Reef and I'm seeing all of this bleached coral and I'm realizing that the reef is dying. And she puts it this way about all the reefs in the world, said they're dying, all of them, and there's nothing anyone could do about it. I can continue to swim among them as if nothing has changed, but in a generation, they'll all be dead. And he goes on to talk about how this is perhaps, even though very dramatic, not unlike the institutional church in America, not the supernatural church in America. Nobody could take that away, but the institutional church. Is it the same for us? Are we swimming around as if nothing is wrong, as if nothing has changed? Are we pretending that we are in a healthy reef and doing things that you would do when things are healthy and good, instead of doing the things needed to bring new life? A lot of this has to do with our comfort zones. A lot of this has to do with our traditions, or just simply, I mean, listen, pastors, we have had, I can't remember or can conceive of a more difficult 15 months than what we've all been through. It's just trying to get to the next week, right? I mean, it's been trying to get through this, to survive it, let alone to think about kind of the big picture of things. So I get it. But if we don't stop now, I think this COVID-19, as horrible as it's been, has created an opportunity for the church in America to hit the reset button and figure out who is it going to be for the people here in this country, and how do we institute those changes? I think it's important to remember the reefs are dying because the sea around them has changed. And this is not unlike what's happened to churches. Now, I don't think churches are off the hook per se for their own decline, but I think we have to acknowledge first, the temperature of the water is different than it was 10, 15, 20, 25, 50 years ago. I mean, the reefs are dying because the sea around them has changed. And this is when we talk about modernity versus post-modernity and the end of Christendom. For perhaps, I know a lot of pastors, we've had courses on this stuff, but perhaps maybe some of the ruling elders haven't had a chance to really dig into this. But Christendom is this idea of like the Christian nation. And you could probably say at one point in this country, we were living in a Christendom model where it's a Christ kingdom, right? Where all the gravitational pull is toward Christianity. I dug up this article. So I grew up in the LA area, and the Los Angeles Times, 1955. This sort of blew me away. This is from the LA Times, not exactly the beacon of Christianity. They had a whole section of just Presbyterian news. Can you believe that? The LA Times, just Presbyterian news. They had devotionals. They would have famous people do devotionals, they'd have, some Western actor kind of give a devotional in the Sunday LA Times. I mean, it was just a different world. And this is also the area that a lot of our churches either were planted, were flourishing, or grew. And it seems like all of our institutional memory harkens back to a day when the heroes of the 1950s and early 1960s grew our churches, and we had hundreds, thousands of members, and it's been in decline ever since. And yet we still have this desire to live in that heyday as if the reef weren't already dead. Christendom, this is defined by Dr. Guter, who is one of my professors at Princeton. He coined the term missional. Christendom is specially designated privileges for the church and society, or maybe I would call it Christians get front row seats in culture. A dominant culture that bore the deep imprint of Christian values, language, and expectations regarding moral behaviors. You can make the argument that we in the 1950s and early 1960s were living in a kind of Christendom. The sea changed, but many are still pretending nothing is wrong. And this is one of the saddest things that I see. Some of you heard me, if you attended the conference, you heard me tell this story about when I went to a church in upstate New York, and I was there on a mission trip. And I always like to visit churches whenever I'm in a new area on a Sunday. And I go to this church and I walk in, and there's like 7 or 8 people there. They're all, at least 75 years old. I was by far the youngest in the room. And I'm looking at the order of worship for the day. I have the bulletin in front of me, and I'm looking, and I see about halfway down the page, there's a spot for the children's message. And, pastors, when we go to worship somewhere else, we're kind of ruined. Like, we're always thinking about what's going on. And I'm thinking to myself as we go, like, how's he going to handle this moment? Is it just going to be like, well, no children, let's continue? Like, what's he going to do? So I'm kind of anticipating this moment in the service, and we get to it, and he pulls up a chair in front and says, and now for the children's message. And I don't think I audibly laughed, but I thought he was making a funny joke. Like, oh yeah, that was, what a clever way of handling it. Just, make it light. No, he proceeded to do a children's sermon with no children in the room. And this children's sermon was not short. It was like 20 minutes long. And I'm looking around, but the older folks in the room are engaged. No children. And then he did the actual sermon later. I'm like, this is killing me. No wonder there's 8 people here. At the end of the service, everybody's drinking coffee from the styrofoam cups and powdered creamer, which, by the way, I'll just tell you this right now. Best practices, lose the powdered creamer. I don't know who does that to people. Churches do. So anyway, we do the powdered creamer, and we're having conversation. And I so badly wanted to ask the pastor, but I didn't want to ruin his day, right? So I just casually asked somebody else from the church. I'm like, well, what's going on? I noticed that there weren't any kids. Do you ever have kids for the kids' message? Oh yeah. A couple times a year, we have some family that come back and visit. We get the kids, and I'm like, yeah, but you don't have any kids in a regular basis? Oh no. Well, how often do you do the children's message? Every week. And so I just kind of asked the logical question, why? And the answer was, well, we like it. We like it because it makes us feel like we're caring about children. I mean, that's an extreme example, but that is a classic one. The sea has changed, but they're still pretending nothing is wrong. If we have that mindset, our churches will empty, I promise you, whether it's a children's message or a lot of other things that we're doing. If you know Howard Schultz's story, CEO of Starbucks, he left the company in 2000. And between 2000 and 2008, the company was only 7 months from insolvency, he assessed. Can you imagine Starbucks being 7 months from insolvency? I can't even fathom that. And there were a lot of theories as to why. Remember what happened during that time, the economy. There were some economic struggles. There was some competition. So both McDonald's and Dunkin' Donuts had huge campaigns to try to compete with Starbucks. And in the end, Howard Schultz determined, and these are just all excuses. You know what really happened? We had forgotten our mission. We had forgotten our mission. We became too cold and sterile and cookie cutter. Our mission is all about people, and we forgot that. Listen, why are churches declining? I think perhaps we have forgotten our mission. I don't think we mean to do it. I think it happens accidentally. But what happens is, pastors, you all know that this is true in your own leadership, no matter how healthy your church is. The gravitational pull is always insiders, right? It's always inward focused. It's all about what are our needs and preferences? What are the needs and preferences of the organization? And we try to meet those things, which is not in first course our mission. We'll get into that. See, here's the thing about reefs I discovered. In many cases, polyps can emerge and tentacles begin to regrow if the conditions are right again. If there's hope for the sea, I think there's hope for Christ Church to get healthy again, to grow again. I think we have an opportunity for an awakening in our country, and that's what I pray for. I pray for an awakening to Christ, that our churches will share the gospel effectively, will live the gospel effectively, and begin to show signs of health again. Now, I don't mean this to say, make a blanket statement, say all of your churches in your presbytery are declining and dying and not healthy. That's not what I'm saying, but hopefully you know what I'm saying. We have a problem in America. We specifically have a problem in the PCUSA. Our denomination has been hemorrhaging people since it was founded. 1983, we've not had one single year of net growth, not one. And it's worse than that. The Northern Church and the Southern churches have not grown, has not had a year of net growth since the mid-1960s. Not 1 year of growth. Been decline ever since. I think we need to address it. It's not going anywhere. But here's the thing, it's not just a sociological problem. It's not just about best practices and mechanics and systems and all of that. Those are important things, but I think there's a theological problem behind it. We all know the Great Commission. Jesus said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. I feel like we forget that part. We're not just meant to create believers or agreeers with Jesus, but obeyers of Jesus. I think for a lot of us in our churches, most folks who grew up in the church, maybe most is too harsh, many who grew up in the church feel like discipleship equals faithful attendance and volunteerism, which perhaps are parts of being a disciple, but as we all know, it runs much deeper than that. Make disciples of all nations and teaching them to obey, teaching them to follow and walk in the way of Jesus, not just talk and believe in the way of Jesus. I think our churches have accidentally created agreeers with the gospel and not doers of the gospel. See, God didn't create a mission for the church. God created the church for God's mission. To be the church is to participate in the mission of God. to care about what God cares about, to do what God does. We are invited in so that we can be sent out. To be missional, then, you hear this word a lot, to be missional is to participate in God's mission to and for the world. This should be our first thought before we get to, well, should I have a contemporary worship service? None of that matters unless you first make sure that you're on the theological foundation that'll get you there. And I know we all know this stuff, but sometimes we need to be reminded to bring it to the forefront for our people, for our elders, for our teams, for our committees. Because when they understand the why, then they're going to be able to start to work with you on the what. Again, when you know who you are, your purpose and path become clear, as Starbucks' story speaks for itself. When they recovered their purpose, they were able to continue to grow. So you're a Matthew 25 Presbytery. Many of us have churches who have signed on to be Matthew 25 churches. And the bottom line of it is that 40th verse, truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And there are three outcomes to this. Three outcomes that being a Matthew 25 church: building congregational vitality, dismantling structural racism, eradicating systemic poverty. These are great outcomes. But I would even say it as strongly as, if you don't do number one, you're not going to do 2 and 3 well. It's because it's about making disciples. And it starts with making disciples of the people we already have, who in many ways perhaps aren't. And I think that's hard. That's kind of life in the main line, right? Is you're fighting uphill against cultural Christianity. It's like the people have been inoculated with Christ just enough, it renders him ineffective. Because they feel like they already know it all. This is the toughest part of revitalization. But here's what I think, and here's what I've seen in my work, is the way forward for our congregations, if you can get them to participate in the mission outward, that's how revitalization happens. In other words, I don't think the answer to growing healthy churches is to say, well, let's have more Bible studies. Let's have more of our kind of programs and ministries that we have always done. I think the recipe is, let's take risks together as a congregation to reach out to people that we aren't currently reaching. Because it's in the process of reaching out and taking that risk that everybody's faith muscle grows. And that faith muscle grows in the same direction. And honestly, it doesn't really matter what the direction is. Pick a thing and go for it. It could be something small. It could be something big, whatever it is. If you feel like as a church, you're doing it together, that's how you get your people to grow and to think more outward than inward. Again, you'll always be fighting the gravitational pull, but it'll get better if you focus on the people you're trying to reach. What happens is it just kind of gets people rowing in the same direction spiritually. So I would say this: before you could do any of those three things, heart level transformation by Jesus is the first step. It really is. Otherwise, they just become programs and they lose their heart after time. They lose their steam. Here's what I mean. So famous passage, 1 Corinthians 13. We've all heard that read more times than we would probably like because of all the weddings we've done. I just did a wedding yesterday, heard it again. And I'm like, it's great, but I don't know. I don't know if it's been a great thing for weddings. So I'm kidding, but we know how it starts. If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Let's do the theological math here. If, like in 1 John 4:7-8, we know that God is love. Let's say we're doing a math word problem. Remember in grade school when you're doing a word problem, what did they tell you? When you see the word is, do what? Put an equal sign there. So if God is love, and more specifically, if Jesus is the embodiment, the fullest revelation of God's love in human history, you could reread this to say, but do not have Jesus, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I speak in the tongues of men or angels, but do not have Jesus, I am only resound. And here's the thing. Congregations revitalize when they rediscover their identity in Christ. If we aren't doing those things like dismantling cultural racism and eradicating systemic poverty, they just become social issues that we want to rally people around, and we're doing it without the love of Jesus Christ. I wonder if it is a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. I think the why actually matters to the what that we're doing. We're not just addressing issues of justice that need to be addressed. We're addressing issues of justice because of the Jesus in us who compels us forward. It is all about Jesus. And I'm not inviting you back to my church because we are, quote unquote, a social justice church, which your church may be, and that may be a really good thing. But if that's the banner, and the banner isn't Jesus first, and we are socially conscious because we believe that's what Jesus requires us to do, then I think we're missing it. We're not inviting people into a gospel of good works. We're inviting them to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I do think there's a theological difference there that's easy to lose when we become advocates for different things. And again, I think advocating for justice is the right move. I think the Matthew 25 initiative is a really good one. But I always think that there's a danger that it becomes more about the works than the one who is working in it all. And I don't think we mean it. I think it's accidental. Congregations revitalize when they rediscover their identity in Christ. If you kind of cut it down to its basic moment, remember in the baptism of Jesus Christ, there's a moment of identity revealing. It's a Trinitarian moment, right? And the Son is revealed in front of all publicly, saying, "This is my Son with whom I am well pleased." It's a moment of identity. And then just after that, you get that moment where Peter comes to Jesus and Jesus says, "And you are Cephas, the rock, and upon this rock I will build my church." Jesus is in the business of revealing identity once you get his identity right. So it was Peter's brother that brought him, said, "And we found the Messiah." And so there's an implicit or tacit faith, I think, that gets Peter to show up in front of Jesus. All of this to say, I think when we help our people understand who Jesus is and what he calls us to do, they discover their identity. We as a church discover our identity as we affirm the identity of Jesus Christ. And I don't think we can assume that everybody has that straight in our pews. I just don't think we can assume that anymore, because why? The sea has changed. Now, there'll be many who get it, but I think part of this whole thing in revitalization is, how do I make sure that we are theologically equipped as a congregation to start talking about change and what we're going to do next? So what this looks like practically is pouring some time into building that foundational work. And the lowest hanging fruit on that is developing sermon series around it, because you can land it in a way that applies to their everyday life. I don't know that this is necessarily a Bible study, because you'll have limited participation. I think whatever your biggest audience is, however many people engage, is probably your Sunday morning experience. So how do you bake this in to talk about it is going to be really important. So I always do this in forms of sermon series. I make sure in our annual meeting, we have one coming up in a couple of weeks, is I do a lot of this vision work there. I do a separate vision series once a year. And it's just a reminder, because life is crazy and busy and people forget. You can't just lay the foundation once and assume it's going to be good. It doesn't matter, that we did that great vision series 3 years ago. Nobody remembers it but us. So we have to make sure we keep communicating it. And what's the theology behind that? It's Trinitarian. It's about the nature of the church, the supernatural reality of the church, not just the sociological reality, right? God's mission is rooted in action. I love this painting. Some of you may be familiar with this painting from the 1400s from Rublev of the Trinity. What I love about it is you have Father, Son, Holy Spirit gathered around in communion, and there's an open side of the table that invites us in to join the Trinity. I always find this really beautiful. But here's the thing. We are invited to participate in the life of God, which is earth-shattering, mind-blowing. But we forget the next part. When we do that, we are also deciding to participate in the life of God's mission. That's who God is in God's DNA, is to reconcile the world back. We have to ask ourselves, if God's mission is rooted in action and what God does, what does God do? Because that's going to define what we are to do as God's church. What does God do? God sends. He sent his son. For God so loved the world, right? He sends the Holy Spirit. Why does he send the Holy Spirit? So that the church will be sent to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and all the ends of the earth. We are the sent ones. We are the ecclesia, called out for a purpose. The entire reason we exist is to participate in the mission of God, in my view, in my theological view. That's why we exist. And I think it's been a little bit like that Starbucks scenario. I think we've forgotten this mission. And I think most of people in our churches, I mean, honestly, if I'm being fully transparent with you, I would be nervous to ask even my own congregation if they understand that. I think it's tough. But I think this is what must propel us forward, not just our best practices, or whether or not we should do a different style of worship service, or whether or not we should target young families. Whatever it is that we're going to do, this has to be the foundation, in my view. God sends as we are sent. We are the sent ones. We are God's plan A to the world. And I often think, like, we have churches. Think about all the PCUSA churches that are planted in your presbytery. Think about all the towns and communities where they could have incredible influence. And I know some churches, I know that the environments around you have changed. I know demographics have changed. There's been urban flight. There's in some areas regentrification. There's all sorts of different dynamics going on about the water. But it's not just that the sea change. It's not the sea change that's going to change the church. It's going to be the scene change inside of us. Are we going to bring the temperature back to health for the healthy things to grow again? And that's on us as leaders. I think we've all been afraid to have those tough conversations with people. And we don't. We avoid them. Maybe the elder that has way too much power, or the volunteer that somehow found their way into every position of volunteer power that you can imagine. And as they say and do things, so does the mission of the church. I know it's tough, but I don't want to have to go to God one day and be like, oh yeah, sorry we weren't more faithful, but Fred was just giving me a hard time. No way. And all of our churches, sometimes we're just a few Freds away from greater health because they stop things. And that's when our polity really works for us. Presbyterian polity is the great power end around. And I think we need to utilize it better. We could talk about that later. We are the sent ones. But here's the problem. If we're to be inviting the world into relationship with Jesus, not all invitations have been very inviting. You know what I'm saying? We're all invited, but I don't know that a lot of us have really been good inviters. I remember getting an invite. It's great getting an invite in the mail, right? I remember getting an invite. Maybe you've gotten one like this. You're invited to Orlando for 2 days and 3 nights. Only $50 a person. However, you just have to attend a brief timeshare presentation. Everybody ever got those? You ever fall for those? Right? Yeah, I've fallen for those, and just, you're just questioning your whole life choices as you endure this. But listen, not all invitations are the same. I think what you're inviting people to matters. Let's say, for sake of argument, that you get an invitation in the mail to attend the Oscars. You and a partner of your choice can walk the red carpet and schmooze it up with all the celebrities. If that's not your thing, invent a different image. But let's say that's the thing. I'd be really excited to go to that. I would say no to the timeshare thing, but I would go to that. So the invite matters. What you're inviting people to matters. Also, the how matters. What's more powerful? Getting a mailed invitation or a personal invitation? Right? Think about a time in your life where you were personally invited to something you really wanted to get invited to. Maybe it was prom. I don't know. Maybe it was a group of friends who you just really hoped would include you and you got invited. It always meant more when somebody came to you and said, hey, look, we'd really love for you to be there. Personal invitation carries a lot more weight. So I think the how of invitation matters. But it's also the who is doing the inviting, right? So let's say now somebody comes to your door. They knock on the door. It's none other than Tom Hanks. And Tom Hanks says, by the way, do you know Tom Hanks is like the most trusted person in America? There was they did a poll on that. Apparently, Tom Hanks is the one. He's America's father. I don't know. But let's say Tom Hanks comes to your door and say, hey, I would like you to be our special guest to the Oscars. Oh, by the way, I'm Tom Hanks. You may have seen me in the movies. We'd love to have you. My wife and I would love to have you. Oh yeah, and there's an after party. You'll come to my house, invite anybody who you want to show up. Right? Who wouldn't seconds later be on their phone, like figuring out who they're inviting and telling everybody? I mean, it would be so exciting to do that. So I think the what matters, the how matters, and the who matters. So why don't we get people this excited for being invited to relationship with God? You can't get a higher what, how, or who. Everlasting life with God, personally invited by Jesus Christ, God incarnate from God himself. Come to me for life to the fullest and bring as many as you can. We've lost our excitement, I think, because we've lost our missional identity. You ever notice that the people in your church that are the most effective at reaching out to people are newer Christians, or Christians who have a revitalized sense of faith? They're the most fired up. They're the most excited. And they're the people that bring in the most other people. Why is that? Because they are engaged in God's missional purpose. The question I think for our churches is, how do we set the table so God can revitalize them? Again, it's not our job. It's the Holy Spirit's job, but it's a partnership. It always has been. How do we set the table so God can feed them? And some of us, we just forgot that we have to set the table at all. It's like we're having guests come over and we're not ready for them. Not only are we not great inviters, but they show up and it's like we're not prepared to receive company. I know that whenever we had company as a kid, I'd be cleaning my closet. My mom would make me clean everything. We're cleaning like the upstairs bathroom. I mean, nobody's going to be in there, but it mattered because you're getting ready to welcome guests and you want to make sure that you have food and all of that. And we've just kind of forgotten that. People are walking into our churches and it's like we're not prepared to handle them, or sometimes we ignore them, or we just simply don't welcome them properly. So I think part of it is we need to rediscover the art of invitation. God sends an individual invitation to us, and Jesus came to personally deliver the invitation and ask us to deliver it to the world. I think for our churches, we stopped actively inviting with our words and our actions long ago. And you only know that because of how you're seeing the culture respond to the church. Something like, I just read this article, 43% of millennials don't believe in God and don't care if God exists or not. 43%. That is a staggering shift. We've been seeing it trend this way, of course, but that is a staggering shift. And I think it's a lot of it's to do with the baggage of the institutional church. The church, the ecclesia, is a movement, not a monument. If we're not useful for the world, we're useless. We're not inviting. The invitation must be sent or it's useless, right? You ever have an intention to invite someone and just not get around to it? Doesn't matter that you intended to invite them. It does no good. So what does this invitation look like? It's always incarnational. It is always personal. I was consulting with a church here in New Jersey, and they had this event where we were going through some things. They had a big picnic, and they didn't have very many young families, but they had 2 new ones join them for this picnic. And it's so funny, they didn't know what to do with them. They're just like, oh my gosh, these 2 young families showed up. And I'm like, well, is anybody talking to them? Like, you should go talk to them. Like, ask them why they came. Like, I don't know. We don't know what to do. So I just walked over and I said, hey, welcome. My name's Jason. I'm the consultant, been working with this church. And someone had told me that you guys are new. We're so happy that you could be here. So how'd you get here? No secret. Both of them, they said, someone invited me. Our church here in New Jersey, we've grown 5 to 7% a year for 9 years. We've never advertised. It's all been word of mouth. It's all been people inviting people. It's always been the #1 way of evangelism, and it will continue to be forever. There is no budget you could spend on advertising that can't get outperformed by personal invitation. That's where it's at. Not saying don't ever advertise, but your people are your greatest asset. If you can empower your people to invite people again, to get better at inviting, it can change the whole dynamic of your church. Why? Because that's when we are in step with our design purpose. When we are inviting people into the gospel-centered ministry, we are doing what we've been created to do. And that's why it works. The invitation must be sent or it's useless. So it's intention and action, working on that together. Here's the problem. I think a lot of our inviting has felt to people like we're inviting them to the timeshare presentation, right? Well, come on to church. Yeah, come, we just want to have you here, but we're going to make you pay. We'll part you from your money and your resources somehow, right? There's a price to pay in the end. That's what they feel like. I know we don't mean it, but somehow we have projected that. Where, okay, what's the real reason you want me? Because I don't know about you. So our area is heavily Catholic. We get a ton of Catholics leaving the Catholic Church and coming to us. And one of their biggest issues is they feel like they're just a number, that the church only cares about their money. And so they have an allergic reaction every time we even talk about money. It's a struggle to try to figure that out and to message that and talk about it well. But I think for a lot of people in our culture, especially younger people, it's like, they just want me for my money. And they're saying that's not true, but just watch, they'll make me pay. I think there's such a skepticism. It's something we have to think about in order to overcome it. But part of it is we just have to be better inviters. Do people really want the invitation to join the party? 43% of millennials don't. So how do we make that better? We need to be better ambassadors. 2 Corinthians 5:20, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. So if you're going to be a Matthew 25 Presbytery or Matthew 25 church, the first thing you have to do is make disciples. And it starts with the people you already have. Okay, we're going to go to our breakout rooms, and there are questions for all of those rooms. I'm not sure how that's being handled, so I'll leave that to your leaders here. But we'll do that and do that for about 30 minutes. You're going to have a conversation. When we come back, I'm going to talk about the sociological implications of the theology. In other words, how does all of this land in practices and what we have to think about in our churches?
Great. So I think that we've got one of the co-hosts is poised to put those questions that you have shared with us in the chat function.
Great.
And I believe that will follow everyone to their breakout rooms. So I think we'll share the questions in the chat first, and then our co-host will do the breakout rooms. Because I'm a little worried.
There. The questions are in the chat.
Okay, I have not seen them yet. Were they to everyone?
There they are.
There they go. There they go.
You have to hit enter for that, right? I got it.
Jen, please, technical moderator. Thank you. And Jason, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Hey, thanks so much. I hope you guys had some great conversation. I'm sure you did. So we're going to move real fast through this second part of the presentation as I just talk about what is this, where does this theology land in the way that we do church. But just know it's getting recorded. You'll get to watch it hopefully again. There'll be an opportunity to see the slide deck that I have in the future. And then there's going to be some Q&A at 12 o'clock your time. We do that for about 10 minutes. So I'm going to move fast. Just hang with me. Okay. So how do we do it? How do we make disciples in this post-Christian culture with all the different challenges that we have? How do we get people who don't think they need God, how do we get them into a place where they feel like they are open enough to even hear a conversation about God? This is the burning question, in my opinion. This is the question that all of our churches need to be thinking about and asking. So I'm going to give you an example. So let's say your church is looking to attract young families. This is usually where churches feel like they need to start. And rightfully so, because you're inviting multiple generations into your church. There is a momentum that happens with young families as far as programming and opportunity. So I think it's a worthy demographic to try to be thinking about. So let's take them for a minute. Where do we land this theology in? How does it inform how we approach them? Well, I think the first thing we need to do is to stop assuming that we know everything a young family needs and ask, what are their needs? What are the assumptions that they're carrying with them about church? What's the baggage that they have? There's a reason they're not engaged in a church already. That reason usually has to do with their own childhood, their own experience of church, usually negative experiences. Not always. Sometimes it's just, I enjoyed church growing up and I just fell out of the habit and we just don't do it. But for most of them, for most young families, even if they're not particularly very religious, they see the value in their kids being exposed to religious education and experience of some kind or another. Now I could say this because I still have some young children. Our generation of parents have definitely made idols of our kids. And, we're trying to do right by them and do the best by them. But I think, we've definitely catered to them in a way that isn't super healthy. However, how could you, if you know that going in, how can you leverage that to engage people in the life of the church? I think there's opportunities. If you want your kid to be well-rounded, right, to get a little Jesus, or maybe you want to hear about why the spiritual life of your kids matters, especially after COVID, we got some great opportunities for you, right? I mean, it's positioning yourself in a way so that you're presenting the gospel in a way that meets the needs in their lives. If it's not meeting the needs in their lives, they're not going to see why it's even necessary. And I know that sounds weird because we're like, why? They should all want to have a relationship with God. Of course they should. That's not the reality. So how do we get past the should and go to what the actual reality is? Let me give you an example. There's this book that came out. This is a secular book by two college professors. I think they're Stanford, called Dreams of the Overworked: Living, Working, and Parenting in the Digital Age. They studied 9 young families and investigated the 3 dominant cultural myths driving their behavior, guilt, and stress. So these are the 3 cultural myths. The myth that they have to be the ideal worker, where they do whatever the boss says whenever the boss says to do it. The myth that they have to be the perfect parent. And you can already see those two myths don't live in the same house, because you can't be the perfect parent if you can't be at all the baseball games, and you can't be at all because you're at work. And the myth that they have to have the ultimate body. It's not just that you got to keep the pounds off. You got to be in shape. You got to take care. And so you've got to do CrossFit. You've got to buy a Peloton. You've got to, whatever it's got to be. And I've got to be that. And none of those three myths can live in harmony with each other, but they're convinced that because the world is telling them that they can. It's creating so much stress and guilt. So what the book talks about is all young families need something that they call scaffolding, people that help them live and work and parent in the digital age. So my question is, how does the church become the scaffolding for these young families? And I think it's all about sacrifice. You know, in baseball, a sacrifice hit is when you hit the ball knowing that the opponent's going to catch it. But what it does is it advances the runners. So perhaps you can score a run, or you just advance the runners. You sacrifice your own batting average for the sake of the team. So how do we reach these young families? We must sacrifice our preferences for the sake of God's mission. Why? Because that mission is what means everything. That's what we care about. Sacrifice is a defining characteristic of disciples. We know from Romans 12, 1 and 2. This is our true and proper worship. In view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. Do not conform to the pattern of this world where it's all about me and what my preferences are, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. I think for our churches, we've got to sacrifice our preferences in order to join God in the mission we've been called to. It doesn't mean you get rid of everything. Please don't hear that I'm saying, well, the answer is you get rid of everything traditional. You just bring a bunch of guitars and colored lights in, and all the young families will show up. That's very foolish, because it's not just about young families, of course, it's about everybody. And there's a generation or two of people in your church who are fed spiritually through a traditional style of worship. You don't just want to throw that away. You want to do what Stan Ott talks about this a lot, bless and add. What can you add that are going to help these young families engage with God? More on that in a minute. What's it going to look like when we reopen? A lot of your churches have reopened. Some of them are in process. What's it going to look like? Are we just going to dial it back to 2019? We should do everything we did in 2019? That would be very foolish, because the world isn't the same place it was in 2019. This is the difference between mission and method. Our mission never changes, right? To make disciples of all nations, teach them to obey everything Jesus has commanded. But the method is changing as fast as culture. You have to do active cultural sifting to find where are the hurts, where are the needs, and how do we leverage those for the sake of the gospel. This is what Paul did all the time when he went to Athens, right? He was invited to go speak at the Areopagus. He was talking to them about all the other stuff. Oh, I see you're very religious. You have all these statues. You even have one to an unknown God. So he's taking their culture and he's using it to say something true about Jesus. But I tell you this, that God that you don't know, I know personally. Let me tell you about him. How are we doing this in the life of the church? That's how the theology meets the sociology, meets the practice. We must translate the never-changing message of Jesus into the ever-changing language of culture. So first you have to make disciples, the community you already are, and then of the community that you want to reach. It's going to take sacrifice to get you there, is my point. You got to start with helping your people develop a sense of mission and discipleship. What is this new way going to look like? How will it be different? How will it be the same? Well, it starts with, I think, the biggest impact on the largest number of people every week, which would be your worship or Sunday morning experiences. I think that's the target. You can do some smaller things for sure, but I think for most of us, if most of our resources are already in our Sunday mornings, let's leverage those resources and not try to invent new resources. You know what I'm saying? It's already a system and a viable mission that we are feeding. So let's just tweak how we're feeding it. Let's figure out a way to use all of our resources for our most important mission. So that might be, we need to come up with new Sunday morning experiences. We need to revamp our Sunday school model because it's so dated and it feels like we are the guy preaching the sermon to the empty room, right? And it's because kids, I mean, just think about Sunday school for a second. Have you been in a child's elementary school in the last 5 years? It does not look like elementary school when you went to elementary school. Everything's in a nice, neat row with your personal desk and it's a lecture. Not anymore, man. There's Chromebooks, there's smart boards, they work in cohorts, they shift from one activity to another quickly. Everything's multimedia. So why does our Sunday school still look like the old way? That's not the way kids learn. No wonder it's not engaging. We got to think about that, right? But again, this all comes with getting to know what young families need. So let me go through some nuts and bolts. I'm just going to quickly talk about a few things prior to your worship service on Sunday. So first-time guests are still deciding about your church and are basing their decision on a few important questions, right? Is your web platform appealing? Is it appealing? It's the new front door. How are all the new people going to find your church? They're going to look for you online first, I promise you. And then if you have a worship service on there, they're going to look at that. And if it is awful, they're not coming. Is your web platform easy to use? Is it clear or is it super confusing? Most of our websites are designed for insiders, not outsiders, which is the opposite of what it should be. Our website should all be designed for outreach. How do we take the skeptic and draw them in to an invitation? I think is a way of thinking about our online presence. Does anyone notice me when I show up online or in person? Or are they all talking to each other? Every church thinks they're friendly because they're friendly with each other. But they sometimes ignore or aren't super friendly to the people who are brand new. If I like it, what do I do next? What are my next steps? Or even just like, I show up with my kids, so I know where the Sunday school is. Do I get to go see the room? Am I dropping them off? What's happening? Do I know where to go? Oh, wait, you don't have a Sunday school, but it said online that you have stuff for children, right? And that, the website hasn't been updated since 2007, right? I mean, we have those things happen all the time. So first-time guests are figuring out your church before they even get to the worship service. In fact, there's a data, Secrets of a Church Secret Shopper by Greg Atkinson says, first-time guests decide if they'll come back within the first 10 minutes of arriving on your campus. What's that mean? It used to be, the old way of thinking was, well, if the sermon's good, they'll come back. And no, they've already decided before the sermon even comes. Parking lot to parking lot. What's that experience like? When they drop off their kid, is the room disgusting? Are the toys gross? You got to think about all those things. I was thinking about, it doesn't cost a lot of money. This was our contemporary worship space when we first launched contemporary service in our church. Not super appealing. We had a bunch of fake trees that were falling apart. It looked like a really bad Jurassic Park. It was terrible. So we got to make this better, man. This is the worst. So we bought a couple of lights and some fabric from a staging company. It cost us, I think, less than $200. And we got rid of most of the plants. You see a couple survived, but it was better. And then over time, as we started doing better and more people were coming, we decided to put up some reclaimed wood in the back. We put the patio lights in our fellowship hall area. We tried to make it a little more inviting, right? One step at a time. You don't have to do it all at once, but you got to think about what are the environments? Or how about worship? I'm gonna go real fast through this. You need to have an honest evaluation of your worship services. Get somebody to come join you and give their feedback. How about the length? In-person length really should be no longer than 60 minutes. Online length, no longer than 45 minutes. Online is trending even toward more episodic than a mirror of in-person service. In other words, not just a camera in the back of the room. It's how you creating something specifically designed for online. Order of worship, most likely different for the two experiences. How do you create moments that lead to movement? How do you engage people's emotions in your worship? It was Bono who said, people are looking for a moment of transcendence. I think he's right. How do we bake in moments, not just a liturgy that's exactly the same every time? How do we bring some heart to our liturgy to wake people up so they don't accidentally fall asleep, spiritually speaking? You create moments through music and prayer and preaching and application, stories of transformation. The more stories of life transformation you can share, the better. Preaching, oh, pastors, you're going to hate this. There's a reason TED Talks are 18 minutes. I'm just throwing that out there. It's like the attention span. People, young families, they respond to sermon series, not lectionary, because they like to chew on a topic for a few weeks. Why? Because they don't come every week. Because they don't feel like they are tracking. It also allows you to say something over a period of time, which is nice. They need it to be accessible, practical, answer their questions. Everybody learns visually now. You got to think about visuals. Make sure you're connecting the dots to Jesus. Don't assume them. Make a 1-point sermon, not a 5-point sermon. Maybe even think about making it interactive. Then there's music, right? You need to think about music style, pre-record versus live stream. If you are a smaller church with limited resources, I strongly suggest you pre-record so that you can fix the audio problems. You can make it better. You don't have the stress of worrying about live recording, which is very hard to do well. And then after the service, how are you tracking people when they visit you? Are you following up? Do they know what their next step is? Can you give them another opportunity to engage? How is social media? How are you following up with people on social media who connect with you? What about special events? How are you giving them opportunities to engage? How do we invite them into a gospel-centered experience that helps them take a step of faith? That's what you're trying to do. And I'll close with this. You got to think in terms of pathways. Churches have lots of programs, but those programs don't have a spiritual intentionality usually. They're usually programs that exist because we've always done them, or something that we've always loved, or just a tradition that we do, which is fine, but it becomes very cluttered and you have all these programs competing for resources. A better strategy is to say, no, how do we create a pathway through our programs for people to take a next step? What is the why behind what we're doing? Do we need to tweak the programs we offer, eliminate some, or add some that we don't currently have? What is the next step I can invite someone to take with Jesus, and how do I get them there through a ministry opportunity? Think about pathways more than programs. And that is how you start to build disciples, grow disciples, to connect with your missional purpose. Let's all get better at the inviting, right? Jesus came to personally deliver the invitation and asks us to do the same to the world. Okay, that's a lot, but we will move into a Q&A time. And I don't know if you're going to record this or turn that part off, but that's up to you. And however you want to handle it, if you want people to speak, that's fine. If you want them to engage in the chat, that's fine too. Happy to do that. Great.
We will keep this recording. And if you would like to put a question in the chat, that's great. Or you can raise your hand to be recognized. We also have some clapping going on in the reactions. So you can raise your virtual hand to be recognized. Or Carol, I see you there.
This isn't a question. I just want to remind everybody that on Wednesday, June the 9th at 10 o'clock, Jason will be with us on the Zoom, this very Zoom, and he'll be there to answer more questions and take it in a more personal way than we're able to do with our time right now. So Wednesday, 10 o'clock, that's Central Time, be here. Okay.
Great. I think that's great because that will give everyone an opportunity to think about what you've heard today and what you talked about in your breakout rooms, and then come and have some one-on-one, nearly one-on-one time, not quite one-on-one with Jason. All right. Do we have any virtual hands raised for questions? While we're waiting on those, we do have a comment that someone said in the comments that we do love what Jason's saying. Do our seminaries have the same focus? If we are not educating our leaders, we will be having the same problems.
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to what seminaries are doing right now because I'm not on the inside of that. But I will say all the leadership stuff that I've had to learn over the years has happened apart from seminary. And I've had to look to other sources to figure that out. I think my doctor of ministry experience with Fuller was good, but I don't know how many in the MDiv programs are getting a lot of leadership training, which is what's really needed to partner alongside the theological training. So I know seminaries are aware of it. I think it's tough. I think they're just struggling too with like, how do they implement it?
All right, a couple more questions in the chat. What does Jason think is the most overlooked part of being welcoming to newcomers?
Well, I think it's two things. I think time in erodes awareness of. Time in erodes awareness of. In other words, we think our building's clean, clear, and inviting. We think we have adequate signage. But put yourself in perspective. It's probably been so long since most of you were new in your church, but when I'm showing up to church for the first time, first of all, I'm nervous. If I got my kids with me, I'm hoping and praying they'll behave. I don't know what the Sunday morning experience is going to be for all of us. It maybe took a whole lot of courage to give church a chance. And I think what gets overlooked is we don't think about it from their perspective. Are they welcomed nicely and not in a creepy way? You ever been to the church where like somebody's new and they point you out in the middle of the service? Okay, and we noticed we got a couple of new families. We'd love for you to stand. And I don't know, me, I'm naturally introverted. That's the kiss of death. I'm never coming back. It's so awkward. I don't want to be put on the spot. I just want to be. You have the church, my friend calls it the church that follows you home. Where like, you get home and there's already a baked good waiting for you. Thanks for coming to church. And it's just kind of creepy, right? You don't want to be that. But I think it's making sure that you are welcoming, paying attention to them, acknowledging that they're there, and making sure everything is clear and consistent. And that the building that you're inviting them to, it is clean. It is not, the children's ministry area isn't half storage area. These are all things that they notice that make them think this church isn't ready for kids. It's not ready for us to be here. I'm going to go find a church that is.
Great. We have another question of, I'd love to
someone said, or asked to wear a new person button. Oh, that's awful. Don't do that, please. Don't do that.
Right.
We also had a question about the first 10 minutes, more about that first 10 minutes during which visitors decide whether to return. I think you touched on that in your last answer, but any other thoughts on that?
Well, I think it means you need to be intentional about what's the experience from parking lot to parking lot. So one of the things is making sure that your team who's doing the greeting, even if that team is one person, whoever's doing the greeting, that they are gifted at it. I've seen a lot of churches where like we need greeters or ushers and you sort of have them do both. And you pass the sign-up sheet around the session table and nobody wants to do it. Or you get people who say yes because somebody had to say yes, but they're not good at greeting people. That's not doing you any favors. You need to identify the people in your church who naturally people gravitate toward and get them out in front. Have them welcoming people, schmoozing with people as they come in. It goes such a long way. That's one very practical step that costs nothing.
All right. We had one other question that I got directly, and that was about websites. Any tips or a good resource for a user-friendly church website?
I'm going to give you my favorite example is an example. Unfortunately, it's a mega church. And I say unfortunately because we tend to think, well, then that means I can't do it. in my regular or smaller church, but I think you can. I would like you to look at northpoint.org's website, and whatever you think theologically about North Point or Andy Stanley, just set that aside and look at what they're doing online. They have so perfected the outward facing website. So I would encourage you to check that out. And think of the reason, think of the why behind the what. What is it they're trying to accomplish? I think that's a good model or template for all of our churches to think about.
Excellent. Well, that hits us right at the 12:10 moment, and it happens to be most of the questions that we got to in the chat, and we don't have any hands raised. So I want to thank you very much, Jason, for this, and the lots of things for us to think about and pray about and consider. And I'm really excited that we'll have the opportunity to talk with you again this week as we think about these things going forward.
Well, happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. And I mean, this is what I love talking about. So if someone's gonna get me to do something on a Saturday, this is what I want to be doing.
Excellent.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
See you soon.
Thank you.